Greetings once again. It's a pleasure to be back, and it's a pleasure to have actually a new topic that we're going to look into. And for today, I'm going to talk about regulatory agilities that were adopted during COVID-19 and the next steps in terms of these. And the reason as to why I'm talking about this actually today is the fact that one, from my professional practice, I practice as a regulatory affairs professional, but at the same time, engaging in policy initiatives and looking at what are the dynamics of the environment, then we need to be able to acknowledge that there are changes that are happening. There are changes that actually some of them were necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic from 2020. And as we are moving through the journey, then what are the advances that have been there? What are the agilities that were adopted? And these flexibilities, were they making work happen better, or were they posing more challenges? And on this particular occasion, then I'm going to focus more on what were the advances in terms of how the flexibilities and the agilities that were adopted were helping us get products available. So at a starting point, one of the key things we all have to acknowledge and we all have to start from is the fact that one, we need regulatory affairs and regulatory measures and systems to be in place to ensure that the medicines, healthcare products, and any technologies that are getting used by the general public, that is patients, and the general community in terms of healthcare providers and all that, are going to be the right quality. They are going to ensure safety and actual integrity of the patient is kept. And finally, they are going to ensure that the affordability aspect that are also considered as well, and they're for the right indications. So when we look at that, then standard practice is for a product or a medicine to be introduced in the market, it has to be registered. At the registration, it has to be confirmed that it's being manufactured from a GMP certified lab or manufacturing site. It has to have all the documentation that is justifying the indication for the medicine, the clinical trials and non-clinical, preclinical studies that were done, and the evidence of that effectiveness and that use that are going to be presented, and even the clinical trial aspect. So all those have to be catered for. And at any point in time, then we need to ask ourselves, what were the measures that were common practice? What were the measures that were adopted? And what is the next step in terms of this transformation and this transition as we're going forward? So for this, the first thing that we have to acknowledge, during COVID-19, some of the countries over time have been having submissions being made physically in terms of dossiers that were either in CTD, documents prepared and actually burnt into compact discs. Some were being submitted in flash disks and all that, which were physical submissions. With COVID-19, there has been a substantial transition, and this transition led to electronic submissions. When you talk about electronic submissions, you'll find I would share just a OneDrive link to the documents that I have to a particular health authority. I would be able to review them from there. Some regulatory authorities moved further to have regulatory information management systems, and this regulatory information management system would be then in terms of portals and websites, where as somebody applying for submission of documents, I would be able to upload them. And if I upload documents, they'll be reviewed by the regulatory authority from the other end, on the other side. So we have two interfaces, the person applicant and the reviewer interface. Once they've reviewed, they ask questions on what need to be improved on. So those were advances. Some of them had been adopted before COVID-19, but also with COVID-19, most regulatory authorities have adopted these measures to ensure there's limited physical contact, but also they're improving on efficiency and review of the documents. So that is something that has been adopted, and I think it's something that needs to be sustained long-term into the future to ensure the most movement in terms of documents and even the efficiency and the cost factors are addressed. And the most critical bit about this electronic submission is that the information will be available on the online platform. If you're looking at it in terms of the website portals and interfaces, then it means in case of any changes, we can see actually what was there initially, what is the new added documentation, and we have an updated document over time about the dossier of the product, which is a good thing for us. Whether it's in clinical trials, new product submission, GMP documents, everything will be up to the standard of what is expected and for that particular site. Any inconsistencies can be spotted, identified, and investigated, which means we'll ensure we have a robust system that is working across the clock, around the clock, to ensure we safeguard patient safety and patient quality. Virtual meetings between the health authorities and industry and also pharmaceutical companies generally was now adopted. Initially, there were to be meetings, then we need to book an appointment with the regulators and the inspectors wherever necessary, have a physical meeting, and that used to be the case. With COVID-19 adoption of virtual working practices, then remote work, we went to the point where we're now having virtual meetings on Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet, Zimbra, whichever platform that you're using. These are now working. I acknowledge that these are advances that are good, and we need to keep them to ensure that in case of any ad hoc and minor inquiries, we can be able to do that. But at the same time, we are human beings. The social connections have to be there, and therefore there still has to be provisions for the physical engagements and physical meetings to discuss the modalities of execution and also to collaborate in the working environments. and challenge ourselves to do better as we improve on the technological advancements. That would be a good thing for us. In terms of GMP inspections, initially the GMP inspection, most of them were on-site inspections, especially from our context. But with COVID-19, then we got to acknowledge that we can do virtual inspections. We can do desk review of documents. And these have been adopted by most of the health authorities now, requiring the applicants to submit documentation that justifies all that site master plans. And even where necessary, the regulatory authorities will now have virtual calls to do virtual inspection of the respective sites, which is a good thing for us because now we are reducing on the cost implications for doing these assessments. We are also reducing on the timelines, because if you have to do an inspection on site, you have to plan your travel. You have to be at the location for a period of time, finish, come back and do reporting. But if the documents have been provided, you're doing virtual, a single day you have gone through the whole industry, we reviewed the documents that have been there, and therefore the timelines would be reduced. And the time that is the product gets to the market will determine whether the patients get it when they need it, or there are delays and we lose some patients, or we're actually not able to treat particular conditions when we needed to do that. So those are some of the things that we need to look into. Then there was an enhanced collaboration between the health authorities, and this is something that needs to be emulated and actually needs to be sustained moving forward. There has been collaboration where you find some health authorities, regulatory authorities are engaging with others and working together. And this was initiated, let's say, from an African perspective. In 2009, the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Framework was established. We have now regional economic communities like the East Africa Community Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, IGAD, Zazibona, the West African one, and these initiatives have been coming. And therefore, with COVID-19, they actually, some of them were strengthened by people working more closely and sharing the work so that they have a single registration for products. But at the same time, over this period, we've seen advances where people are sharing information and actually recognizing and relying on information that has been evaluated and reviewed by other health authorities. Case in point would have like the WHO pre-qualification pathway that has been in place, but now more health authorities in the African continent who are adopting them and actually adopting reliance and coming up with guidelines. So in this case then, if a product is registered and actually approved by the WHO pre-qualification pathway or a stringent regulatory authorities, which generally refers to members of the international community on harmonization on the product qualification for pharmaceutical products. So if you meet those criteria, there will be reliance. We have an agreement. We can make expedited reviews and approval of products because of that. That is going to promote collaboration, experience sharing. We have the most stringent and actually most advanced regulatory authorities being able to share perspective with less developed, and in that knowledge information sharing, we are strengthening our regulatory system. And these collaborations are important. Joint assessment procedures, reliance, recognition, and actually collaborative engagements and advances as we move forward. Those are things that we need to engage. Then reliance and consideration of real-world evidence that is coming up. Over COVID period, there were no medication or no therapies for COVID-19, and therefore we needed to see how do we get these medicines. The time for doing clinical trials were limited, and one of the key things that happened was certain products which had shown some level of efficacy and some level of value were being taken into the market to be used in patients. And when they were used, then the physicians and the clinicians were generating the real-world evidence of the use, whether it's effective or not, the side effects that were coming up, and these were being documented. So it means rather than an individual pharmaceutical company providing all the information, they would provide it, but also collect it from the physicians. And from the physicians dealing with patients in hospitals, were also able to relay these to the regulatory authorities through the pharmacovigilance system, risk management plan systems, and even the drug registration departments. And this information being available then informs the regulator whether to register the medicine or not register it, remove it from the market or maintain it there. And this adoption and use of real-world evidence is becoming a winner for us because we have clinical cases, and most of the cases we need to deal with based on what we see in patients and how that impacts the quality of care that they receive. So this is something that needs to be adopted, and I'll be talking about it in a subsequent video on how we can work on real-world evidence, real-world data to see that we are improving access to quality medicines and using evidence to make those decisions where some of the reasons might not be there, might not be available when they are needed. So those are some of the things that we need to look at. Then adoption of risk-based assessment approaches. We're looking at what critical information do we need in terms of registering a medicine, and look at it even from the example that I gave on COVID-19. We've seen that this medicine that has been used in other conditions. Therefore, in terms of the overall scale of it, it has to be having some safety. So we need to focus on the clinical value. So in case I'm registering and actually positioning for a new indication, then the most critical information the regulator would need to look at would be is the clinical efficacy, the clinical data that is being presented, rather than the quality information, because manufacturing is the same, every other thing is the same except for the indication, that is of the clinical bit. So that makes the evaluation and review better and faster. That would be good for us. And the same is applying even when you're using excipients. We have medicine A and medicine B. An excipient had been used in medicine A and it was found to be effective and actually no adverse events. So in risk-based analysis, we need not go further in looking at that particular excipient, but rather focus on the API that is now being introduced, the new active pharmaceutical ingredient. And this risk-based approach reduces on the timelines, improves efficiency, and ensures that we look at what is really critical and what matters in ultimately ensuring we have safe, effective, and quality medicine that are being used by the patients that we are serving. And those are critical things that we need to look into. In other cases, for submission, there was need for wet ink, that's physical signatures that were done by pens. But with COVID-19, that in certain cases was not feasible, and also we are reducing personal contact and contacts with objects. Therefore, it wasn't adopted. And in this case, the agilities that came was one, we adopt use of electronic signatures, and if not electronic signatures, email confirmation as evidence of consent or not consent, or signing, actually taking responsibility for it. Because ultimately, why we need signatures is to confirm that we are taking responsibility for whatever it is. That was an adoption that actually was there, and we are taking it moving forward. Then for clinical trial space, there has been remote monitoring of clinical trials. You see, as the clinical trial applicant, the site that is doing clinical trial site, there's need to be monitoring. And because of the challenges with travel and all that during COVID, there was remote monitoring where we could use digital technologies and all that to ensure that we're able to monitor these interventions. After COVID-19, these still have a chance, because it doesn't mean that things were not being done the right way. We just found a new way to do them because we were forced by the circumstances. So moving forward, we need to adopt remote monitoring, also look at it in terms of validation of the data that has been recorded. But the key thing, we have to ensure that the safety of the patient or the participants in the clinical trials is safeguarded all across. And I'm glad that the Pharmacy and Poisons Board actually developed guidelines focusing on clinical trials during COVID-19, which was looking at what are the modality, what are the changes. If you needed to liaise with the participants for the trial, instead of coming to site to have discussions with them, you could have phone calls. And these were provisions that were made. So these are things that need to be adopted as we move forward. That will be key for us. Another thing, over time, most of the work in terms of product development, quality improvements, have been left to the pharmaceutical industries and the biotechnological companies, which has been the case. During COVID-19, we saw transition, and the transition, actually, case example is Pharmacy and Poisons Board partnering with the WHO Africa Regional Office through the UHC Regional Life Cycle Program, and also the UNIDO in Empowerment, with a focus on technical support to local pharmaceutical manufacturers and producers of personal protective equipment, and even the alcohol-based sanitizers. So this technical support is needed by our local companies, which might not have the initial capacity to do better and actually improve on their qualities. But when COVID-19 actually brought this to fore, then we realized that regulators can have a role in ensuring they build technical capacity. And this is something that needs to be taken forward. And I think as we are looking at what advances we need in terms of vaccine manufacturing, genome therapy, gene therapies, precision medicine, and everything that's coming up, our regulatory authorities anchored on the government framework and having collaborative engagement through international policies and trade agreements, then we're able to drive technical capacity building for our local pharmaceutical industry. And I think this is something that needs to be adopted post-COVID-19, because it happened during PPEs, alcohol-based sanitizers. But what is next? We are not going to depend on only that. We need additional therapeutic lines. We need additional interventions. So how is the regulator going to play this place? And I think there's more to be done by the regulators on that. Then the other bit is enhanced pharmacovigilance. We noted that during this period, there was more communication from the regulatory authority from pharmacovigilance. There was actually the rollout of the USSD code, *271#, where everybody could report any adverse events, any suspected adverse reactions, whatever they felt like was off with a particular medicine they were using. And that was a good thing. And the most critical bit is it was now moved from pharmacovigilance being a regulator thing and a pharmacist responsibility to a wholesome responsibility of the healthcare ecosystem, where from clinicians, nurses, doctors, everybody had a role. And that was made clear in terms of the communication. It needs to be sustained long term so that everybody believes they have a role to play and they're playing that role where they need to play that role, because we all need to count on each other to safeguard patient safety. And safeguarding patient safety doesn't happen if we leave it to one particular faction or responsibility to an individual agency. That is critical. Another thing that I noted during COVID-19, and especially with regard to the AMA, African Medicines Agency, the patient organizations took the forefront because they realized all that we do, from a pharmaceutical company, from the regulator, from the general public, from the physician, the clinician, the nurse, everybody is working towards safeguarding the patient safety and ensuring patients have access to the quality medicines. And one of the key things to do that is to ensure we have strong regulatory frameworks. And these strong regulatory frameworks are only possible when we're working together and we're pushing for them. And AMA, African Medicine Agency, is one third pathway. And therefore, one key thing that was done by International Alliance of Patient Organization, IAPO, was to take lead in actually championing for the establishment of the AMA Treaty, AMATA. And on that case, then, most stakeholders joined in. We moved forward, and now we've gotten to the space where the ratification has been done by the minimum number that was 15 a while last year in November, October. Then now the next phase is establishing the agency, where now a headquarters has actually been identified to be Rwanda. So we are moving forward, and patients taking responsibility brings the patient perspective. We are not going to leave patients' well-being to the masses of other stakeholders, so they're taking a lead, and that is something that needs to be carried forward. Beyond just strengthening and advocating for regulatory reforms and regulatory systems, it needs to move now to clinical research. What is the perspective of the patients? And that already has taken ground, and it's growing over time. We need to drive that forward, and we need to see what other touch points do we have patients critical at, and what are their challenges, what are their experiences. We have expert patients, general patients, and the specific focus areas on how we need to improve care for these patient populations. And from a regulatory standpoint, having IAPO lead this conversation and this move towards ensuring AMA is established, then that is a move to the right direction, because we're having patients taking the lead. That is good for us. Then risk-based analysis in conduct of trials, we have to look at what are the benefits, what are the risks. We don't need to do clinical trials that might not give us as much valuable information when we need it, and therefore during that period there were some flexibilities. We can suspend a trial, don't suspend it, do it in controlled environments. Not much of a controlled environment could deliver medicines to patients in their homes. Those flexibilities were being adopted because we see what is the risk, what's the benefit, and what is the contribution of this to the ultimate end goal of ensuring patients have reliable access to medicines when they need them. And that would be good. Then the other bit at this point when regard to the clinical trials was to ensure we have expedited review of clinical trials, especially for products that were promising and had hope that they would help in dealing with the pandemic at that time. So these were in terms of joint reviews with the institutional review boards, the ethical review committees, and the regulatory authorities, even more of them coming together. The joint reviews were a win. For trials that were going to be done across different countries, for example, in an African context, the WHO AVRF forum was being adopted, and even Pharmacy and Poisons Board was a partner participating in some of the reviews, so that we could have a single approval of a particular clinical trial, which would be done in multiple countries. That is an advancement, because you then, as an applicant, I don't have to submit in a particular one country and leave the other countries. And these are advances that are going to help us in expediting the reviews and expediting the initiation and conclusion of clinical trial to make the medicines available to the patient at a faster time and across different geographies, which is important. The other thing, in most cases, you'll find there was sequential application, where you submit a clinical trial application, then into the ethical review board. Once done, that is when you admit it for regulatory approval. In this case, there was adoption of the parallel submission, where you can submit to the ethical review and also the regulatory authority. They both review and share their insights. So at the end of the day, it will be expediting and reducing the timeline from application to approval, which was a good thing. And those are some of the advances that are coming forward. Then there would be a pre-submission meeting. Before you submit a clinical trial, you have engagement with the regulatory authorities to gain insights, to understand what technicalities, what hurdles are you facing, how can you go about them, to ensure that you don't have so many questions, but you also don't have substantial information missing in the application document that needed to be provided. So that kind of ensures that you reduce the number of queries, you shorten the timeline, you make your clinical trial executed and working at the right time in the right framework that is needed. So what are the next steps for us? The next step is we adopt some of the practices that I've just discussed into our mainstay regulatory system, strengthening approaches to ensure we move forward. So that is on regulatory agilities. And also we have to look at it from, we have to work collaboratively and engage to ensure that we have an ecosystem that is working for all of us with a focus on serving the patient. If we're able to do that, then we'll be on a better level. And I think the regulatory agilities are just a challenge for us to see there's more that we can do. There are so many flexibilities that we've never positioned ourselves to see which is possible. So now let's make them possible by knowing they can happen, they've happened, and we may now mainstream them in terms of our policy and frameworks that we're going to adopt in terms of regulatory systems. So thank you so much for engaging. Thank you so much for following these. If you find these insightful, please share with your colleagues, subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going. Any queries you have, use the comments for me so that I'm able to respond to some of them. Thank you and have a good one.